be talking about some call recording channels or something like that. He unfortunately was unable to make it, so on Friday I was asked to do a talk. So I built this over the last 2 days. So I got a little bit, ahead of most of the presenters of their Dialplan and presentations getting done. So I'm Leif Madsen. I'm a co-author of Astra's Future Telephony and the Definitive Guide, along with Jared Smith, Russell Bryant, and Jim Van Megelen. I'm the lead UC systems engineer at Thinking Phone Networks, started there in December. We basically build multi-tenanted systems in cloud with analytics and other things. So I basically work with a bunch of really great guys who basically use Astra full-time and other proxies and things like that. Previously, prior to that, I consulted for 8 years and essentially specialized in distributed systems and database integration. If you've been to prior AstraCons, you've probably at least heard of me talking about distributed queues. If you were at Paul's talk this morning, that's the future. That talk is now old school. In fact, with ARI, this talk is old school. But it still, I think, is going to be useful for the next few years for sure. I'm an attendee of 14 AstraCons, including if you include the 4 AstraCons in Europe. I can thank Steve Sokol for a pretty awesome trip to Europe. So what is a Gosub? It is a block of code that can accept arguments and return information. It basically allows you to take Dialplan snippets and make them reusable. If you start building things correctly, then essentially you can utilize those things across your Dialplan, which will make things much easier. It makes the Dialplan easier to read, and the main thing is reduction of duplication across your system. If you're not familiar with what Gosub is, but you've been using Dialplan and you're familiar with what a macro is, you'll be pretty much caught up here in a second. Gosub is essentially a replacement for macro. It's a little more powerful. The way that it has been implemented gives several advantages and allows you to do things that you can't do in macro. Tillman Lesher wrote Gosub, and it's really quite good with the implementation and how it works. In its most basic form, you can think of a Gosub like the goto application, but with memory. So you essentially do a goto, and you have a return path, and it returns back to where you came from. One of the biggest things that I like with Gosub, which can be a little confusing, is that essentially you can go into a Gosub, you can enter there, and then you can go to somewhere else into an entirely different context, and then from that location you can run return, and it'll actually jump back to where the original Gosub executed from. You can't do that in macro. It's not necessarily a good design element, but if there's sometimes you run into situations where it makes sense. So what about macro? It has limitations in its implementation. The biggest one being its heavy use of stack space, which is essentially memory. The issues that are most apparent are when you start nesting macro. So a macro that calls a macro, that calls a macro, that calls a macro. And you can only do 8 levels. Once you get there, essentially Astra will crash. Gosub has no nesting limitation. I've built it where I've just basically let it run in a loop and got into like 10,000 levels of nesting, and Astra happily keeps running. Just due to the way that it's been implemented, there's no limitation essentially, other than physical memory in the system, and the amount of information that Gosub uses to maintain its state and where it came from is very small. It's like basically a channel variable. So macro is no longer actively maintained, so and with the flexibility of Gosub, there's really no reason to continue utilizing macro. So my presentation is going to have a lot of Dialplan in it, so I'm just going to kind of freeform a bit with it and just kind of go through and mention some stuff. So we're going to be seeing a lot of slides like this. So it's essentially all about the syntax. We have an entry context. We have a starting extension. I've called it start. My style is to prefer on the very first line to always use the verbose or no-op application, so you'll always see that there. The main reason for that is so that when you start adding same and things like that, you can move things around the Dialplan quite easily, and the first line basically just never has to change. So it's essentially entry point with some little bit of documentation. So on line 3 here, we've got a Gosub that we're calling, and the basic syntax is the context, the extension, and the priority number. So sub my routine is the context, start is the starting extension, which could be anything you want, and 1 being the priority, so the first priority. It could also be a priority label, so it could be a string as there as well. You'll see the 2 brackets that are closed together. It has nothing in it. We'll come back to that, but that's essentially how you pass arguments. And so if we go into the subroutine, it looks very much like a normal context. There is no macro dash or sub dash. The sub dash that I've got at the beginning here, or sub underscore rather, is a personal preference. I like to throw the sub under there. It means nothing. It could be hello. It could be just my subroutine. It could be anything you want. So there is no syntax format. What I'm showing is just based after years of use and my preferred style. So we enter the subroutine, we enter at the start extension, we go to the next line, we run a verbose application, and then we run the return application. That is the next biggest difference between macro and subroutines, is that a subroutine will not return unless you execute the return application. With macro, if it gets to the end, essentially it will just auto return for you, or you can of course run the macro exit application, but you have to specifically call the return application, and that will return back to essentially, in this case, the line 4. So that's where you get into the kind of the funny thing where you are able to go to another location and then execute a return, and it will always return back to that line 4. Make sure that I actually follow some sort of time here. So here is a fairly perhaps typical block of Dialplan. We have an entry context, we have a pattern match, and we have a bunch of stuff happening here. Not the easiest bit of Dialplan to follow. It's kind of the point here. So essentially what we do is at line 3 here, we enter into the first bit of actual logic. I'm setting a channel variable called safe_extend, running it through the filter function, which is essentially making sure that because of the dot, which could be anything, alphanumeric, that I'm filtering out anything that is not a number between the values 0 to 9. I have a goToIf, which is checking to see if caller ID name is populated, is not blank. If it is blank, then it will go to the invalid CID name extension, which is down here at the bottom at line 13, which just basically sets it to anonymous and then returns back using goTo, the safe_extend, and back to the label set CID name, which is at line 5. So once we fall back there, we do a dial for 30 seconds. We do a check against dial status. If it's not congestion, then we go to all done here, which is line 10, which essentially is a no-op, and then goes to a hang-up. If it's not congestion, it will continue at line 8, where we'll call our backup provider and playback. If that also returns and does not complete, then we'll do a playback, silence 1, which would answer the call at this point if it's not already answered, and playback a prompt of all outgoing lines are unavailable. Fairly typical. It works. Not necessarily something wrong with it other than it's not very elegant and it's not very reusable. So if we were to take that and maybe start breaking that out into some subroutines, we do get much more verbose, but we get something that we can reutilize. So same thing, entry context, we enter in. At lines 3, 4, and 5, I've now broken out those basic concepts into 3 subroutines. The first one being make it safe, the next one make it valid, and the next one make it dial. Of course, you'd flesh this out some more so it was even more reusable and stuff, but in terms of space, I've essentially been able to do all the things that I just did on the last slide. The first one, make it safe, which is basically taking whatever was in the extend channel variable, passing it to the make it safe subroutine, and running it through the filter. I did not. I'm actually missing an argument. So I added a second argument actually here when I originally wrote it. So line 3 should actually be extend, comma 0-9. So then when you enter it at line 9 here, basically go in and we utilize a function called local. And what this does is when we return from the subroutine, those local channel variables essentially go away. The purpose of that is so that if I start nesting subroutines, I can actually have the same channel variables called, and I don't obliterate the previous set of the subroutine. So if I go into one subroutine, enter into another one, and I happen to call it the same thing, but I use local, it doesn't matter because I have different namespace essentially that is local to that subroutine. So once I return, it strips that off of the stack and then returns back, and the values that you originally set still maintain the correct values that you set previously. So you can do some pretty cool things at that point, which is kind of nice. The other thing is you don't clutter up your memory space, that once you get out of the subroutines, you have all these channel variables laying around that you just don't care about. So either you would have to clear them out so they're nulled out, or you'd have to do some sort of cleanup routine and care about it. With local, you don't have to. There's two things with local, which I will mention. Once you've set it with local within the subroutine, you no longer have to call it again with the local function. So like if you're familiar with functions, when you read it, it looks a lot like the caller ID, like on line 4 here. Caller ID name is a read of a function, so it has that dollar curly brace kind of syntax. You don't have to call it that way. So you can see on line 12 here, I'm just calling it as this filter and this unsafe string. So you don't have to wrap it with local, which makes it much less verbose. The other thing is you shouldn't call local multiple times on the same thing. We've run into issues with that. So basically, once you've set it initially, once you've entered in, just don't worry about using local anymore. It just needs to be done on the initial part. So we return at line 13, which takes us to executing at line 4. And I think we essentially get the gist here. We follow through. We've broken it into 3 separate subroutines, and we can reuse it. So what we had before on this screen essentially turns into this, which is much more elegant and much easier to understand what is going on to a certain extent. Yes? So those are global variables. You haven't seen them. I haven't defined them. G underscore is a syntax that I like to note that, oh, that's a global variable. The other thing that you'll also notice is uppercase. When you see full uppercase, it's typically because it's either built in to asterisk, like it's been defined that way, or it's a global variable. And otherwise, you'll see like this mixed case of this underscore filter with variable, which makes it look more like it also makes it, you see Dialplan where the entire thing is like a big long line and it's all uppercase with brackets. It's like, I don't want to read that crap. So something else that, obviously a lot of people have Dialplan that contains macros already. And now that you're at this talk, you're like, man, I love Gosubs, but now I got to convert everything. So this is maybe a somewhat typical macro. Older style, maybe asterisk 1.4, we're upgrading to something 1.8 or newer. And we're not really using the same format. We're using extend S or something, and we're defining every single line. Luckily, we're not using priority numbers because we got rid of that in 1.2, I believe. So we've at least done that part. However, we've entered the macro. We have this fancy macro dash, a lot of lowercase stuff here. We've got our lines. We've got arg1 peppered throughout, and I don't quite understand what arg1 is throughout it, so I'm reading the code, and I'm like, what the heck is arg1? It's not well defined. It's not been set as a variable or anything like that. And even if we did, we don't have the local function, so we would have, again, channel variables peppered all throughout our memory space. So this is a very simple thing. Basically takes 2 arguments. Argument 1 is the the field name, and arg2 is the value, and I'm just appending it to the CDR user field as some value that I've appended. And then I run macro exit because I'm exiting. Line 4 just does a check, make sure I have 2 arguments, and if I don't, then I just jump out of the macro. So the same thing re-implemented in subroutine looks something like this. Thanks to Paul for the documentation style. I now build things out that way so that they can actually be parsed out, so my subroutines are now also documented. Again, arg1 and arg2, which you can see enter in here at lines 14 and 15, are assigned to the local variables called field name and field value. I've documented them here as field name, the name of the field to append, and it's a type string. And the field value, again, is a value of the field to append and type value string. You'll notice at line 13, which I will come back to, a subroutine that is called subcheck vars, and it passes a value of 2 to that subroutine. What it does is a subroutine that we've built to check to make sure that when I enter the subroutine, if I'm expecting 2 arguments, that I get those 2 arguments, and there's no point in continuing if I don't have them. The system will actually return. And there's some really neat stuff that will go along with that, which I'll come back to in a second. So pretty simple, not very difficult. I take my arguments, I assign them to local, and I basically do the exact same thing, except I'm not utilizing arg1 and arg2. I'm using something called field name and field value, which is a little nicer to read. And I pretty much have, a pretty nice little subroutine here. So that's how I've converted a macro into a subroutine. I have until 3 o'clock, right? Is that true? Okay. Comparing the calls. So this is essentially, once I've built my macro and subroutine, I have to be able to actually utilize it. So the difference here is pretty self-evident. We've got macro, which has that syntax where when I define the macro, I have macro dash in the context name, but I don't utilize it here. And then arg1 and arg2, which is in this case a CID name, and arg2 is the caller ID name. The same thing with the subroutine. I have subappend user field, which I've called, which is just straight up the context name. Start, which is the extension, and 1 is the priority that we're entering into. So it's a little more verbose. Again, when I came back, the other example I had was just 2 brackets together with nothing in between. So now I filled that out, and I have arg1 and arg2 essentially, which again is CID name and caller ID name. So another advantage to subroutines is that you have the ability to return data now. It's mostly designed for single values, but it's just a string, so you can pass back things like with commas and things like that in there, and then you can parse it back out using cut or something to that effect, or hash or array or something like that. But in this case, I have a context which is passing into a subroutine. I mean, obviously, this is like a very simple example where I would just use the len function. And in fact, I'm using the len function for length, but I've actually built it into a subroutine. So I can pass it. I did it again. I didn't pass 2 arguments. So at line 3 here, I have the extend that I'm passing into it. Oh, I know why. That's fine. It's actually correct. So I enter in. At line 8 here, I take the string that I'm passing it. I assign it to this string, which is argument 1. And this next line is setting a local value, which is going to contain the length, into a variable called this length. I utilize the len function, pass the variable that I just set called this string. I return a value of the string length, which in this case would be 2 if it actually, or sorry, I'm sorry, 4 if it actually matched and triggered here due to the pattern match, which is static. Set it to that, and then I do return at line 10, and I pass it back whatever the value is of this length. Once I return, I continue executing at line 4, which does a set of this length. Again, you can see I have 2 different namespaces, even though I've got the same this string called, and this length. I'm sorry, this length, not this string. And there's a built-in channel variable when a return executes called Gosub retval. And so whatever the value of that, I'm assigning to the channel variable called this length, and that's pretty much how you utilize returns. So exception handling, which is a thing I've actually started utilizing very recently. I started getting really into building some fairly complex Dialplan for some IVR handling, which is utilizing a lot of nested subroutines and is being executed and managed through a database. So I essentially go to a database, return a bunch of rows using FunctoDBC in multi-row mode, and each of those rows actually contains what subroutine is supposed to execute at each part of the Dialplan. So the entire subroutine thing is all static. The Dialplan never changes. Within the subroutines, it looks up data from the database, but which subroutine is actually getting executed is also pulled out of the database, which is slightly different than some of the things I've done, so it's another layer. So the reason from there, essentially, the reason I got into using exception handling was to make sure that, because I wasn't really going to be totally in control of what was happening at each step of the way through the dial plan, I wanted to make sure that I didn't just keep executing things from what was happening from the data pulled back from the database. So I wanted to add some exception handling. I believe it was Matt Nicholson that added this initially, so it's not used very much, but it does seem to work fairly well. So it just allows you to add some validation, essentially, to your dial plan. So here's a small snippet of some exception handling. I've simplified it a bit, but this is actually from my, from our production system. And so extend E for exception, is a built-in extension just like I and S and T, things like that. So it's built in. All it's doing here is executing the log application and telling me what the exception reason was. Exception is a Dialplan function that is built in, and reason is an argument that is part of it. And it contains other values like context, extension, and priority, so it can tell you what context, what extension, what priority triggered the exception. So when you look at your log, an exception happened, I can actually go back and look and see what was caught and stuff like that. So I can pass the reason in, and what I'm just doing here is essentially a case statement in so many lines using goToIf, which is triggering and matching on different reason codes that I've added in there. And then if it matches, I do a goToIf to an extension within the exception handler context name. And then essentially, once we get there, then I do different things. And then if nothing matches, then I just hang up. It's like, well, an exception was triggered, and I've decided that there's nothing matching on it, so either I have a typo or something else. So I'll just hang up the call because I don't really have anything else I can do that's reasonable. Was there a question back there?
Yeah. All right, so you've got those reasons, missing prompt, arguments, invalid, fatal error. Did you define those, or is that something that...
I define those. Those are self-defined. They could be called foobar and baz if I wanted. Doesn't matter. They're just... So I'll show an example here on the next slide.
Okay.
So right here. So I do an exec if. Sorry for it's too long of a line, so this is actually a single line of Dialplan. Do an exec if. If exists arg1, then I set... a local value, total arg count equals, and then arg1 is assigned to it. Then the colon, there is the side for the true and the false. If it fails, then I end up in the raise exception. So I do raise exception, which is a Dialplan application, and a string of some sort. I can pass it anything I want there. It's totally self-defined. And I basically pass it arguments invalid. So that would match here on line 23, which would go to arguments invalid, which then jumps down to line 36. I trigger a log, and I run a stack pop, which is just more of an internal thing. And then it executes a return. So there's that example where I'm in a subroutine, and I've jumped somewhere else in the dial plan, and now I'm returning back out of that subroutine. So I've got arguments invalid. I've entered a subroutine. I've done a check. I've triggered an exception that says you don't have the correct number or you are missing an argument. So I'm going to gracefully return from that subroutine and continue executing from where I called. So that return is not linked into the exception handler context at all because it's not a subroutine. It's just another context in the dial plan. But the subroutine that triggered this normally would have a return that would return gracefully after it had executed its stuff. I've just essentially caused it to return early before it executes all that stuff. So nesting subroutines with macro, there is a big warning if you do core show application macro, which really all this says is use Gosub because you can't get above 7 levels of nesting because we'll basically crash the system. I've run into this before, and it will happen much, much earlier if you start doing anything like FunctoDBC. So if you nest multiple macros, in this case 2, I call a macro, which calls another macro. And if that macro happens to be utilizing FunctoDBC to return information from a database, Asterisk will crash. So another great reason to be using Gosubs and subroutines in general, and to avoid macro. So here's an example of nesting some subroutines. I've got subappend user field, and there's that subcheck vars that I said I'd come back to. So the first thing it does is another Gosub call, which is subcheck vars. I'm expecting to get 2 arguments in this case, which then enters this subcheck vars. I've included that context, which I showed earlier, called exception handler. I can reutilize that in many subroutines, so I can include that context in these subroutines so that I can handle these things. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but this was actually built by Brad Watkins, also Marquee 42 and IRC, which essentially does some fancy stuff using the stack peek function and basically checks a bunch of stuff to make sure that the subroutine that was previously called has the arguments that are expected and the number of them that are expected. Otherwise, it will raise an exception called arguments invalid and perform a return. You'll see here, I thought there was a, local peek. So that's another function that was created to do some lookups in another subroutine. But like I said, I'm not going to go into this. This is fairly complex. If you're really, really interested, we can go through it after or something like that. But you can do some core show functions, things like that, look at what those functions are, and you'll get a pretty good idea as why this works. Oh, I'm at the end already. So I probably have time for lots of questions, it looks like. Additionally, if you want to come work for me or work with us, we're hiring too. So, questions? Really? I just fly through it that fast?
Leif is also one of the authors of the definitive Asterisk guide. So you should take advantage of his knowledge.
You can ask me anything. It doesn't even have to be related to this presentation. I don't care. Just ask questions. That'd be cool.
Wait.
What'll happen if you leave out your return on the Gosub?
I think it just stops executing.
Okay, so.
I believe it doesn't hang up.
So
Just like it runs out of
dial.
like if it was just a run out of Dialplan in general, it's the same rules. There's nothing separate of it. So it'd just be like I got to the last line of I did a go to and it ran out of Dialplan to execute. Whatever your system was by default, I believe it's a hang up, but I think it can actually do something else, like with some option in asterisk.com. But yeah.
So any idea why macro is more clever in that sense?
Why is macro more clever? That it just auto returns basically?
Yes.
Just the implementation, I guess, in that it wants an explicit return.
Alrighty.
So it's like a lot in my style when I write Dialplan, I pretty much always throw a hang up at the end, even though obviously it's going to hang up anyways, but it's more of a marker. So if you write it again, I mean, same thing with like a return or something, but yeah, you kind of get into that situation where, oh, I forgot to run return, or I've got a typo in the word return or something, then that kind of sucks. Question in the back.
So with macros, there are special macro-specific variables that are defined by calling the macro. Mm-hmm. Do you have the same thing with Gosubs? Like Gosub extend or something? No,
they're not. It doesn't work quite that way. So that's one of the potential things. I'm trying to remember if there's a function that lets you do that. I guess you might be able to utilize local peek or something actually to pull that information out. But yeah, there's no like built-in, other than retval, I'm pretty sure that's the main one. There isn't like that macro extend, macro context, macro. That doesn't exist. What populates Gosub retval? Is that, can you define that in your return statement or? Oh yeah, so if we go back here to the example, I do return, it's just like an argument basically. I just put whatever string I want in there, like OK -1, the value of this length.
And if you not put the return, what happened?
If you don't put the return, it would just like the Dialplan would just continue executing and it would probably hang up.
In the old contest?
Just like any other, because almost from the viewpoint of asterisk, a Gosub isn't really anything other than a normal context. It works exactly in the same way. All the same rules apply. So if I just had a context that just stopped executing, or I fell all the way through and it didn't have any hang up or go to or playback or something, then whatever the default is in Asterisk, which I believe is hang up, at least in the latest versions, it will just, that's what will happen. Same thing in a subroutine. It doesn't do anything different, like unlike a macro.
Okay, the other example in 2 levels of macro and funky or DBC is 2 levels crash?
Yes.
And
It's
goes
due to the way that macro is implemented. It is very stack heavy, and I won't pretend to understand every little nuance about what that means, but its implementation is not as elegant as the way that Gosub is done. So when you execute a macro and another dial plan function that happens to also be quite stack heavy, it basically crashes the system.
with Gosub, no. If you use Gosub, no.
If you go sub, you can do that 10,000 times and you'll be fine.
Okay.
Another question over here.
Hi, so you know how we have that M, capital M option in the dial list
U,
of
capital U.
options? So we do have something like this.
Yeah,
called
capital
Gosubs.
U is the same. So what he's asking basically is in the dial application, just as when you call a channel just before it's answered or just before it's bridged, it will execute some dial plan, or sorry, it'll execute a macro. The same flag exists, it is capital U, and it will execute a subroutine.
Cool, thanks.
Any more questions? Here's one.
Is there any way you can debug or troubleshoot what's wrong or syntax error?
It would be the same thing that you would do for normal dial plan. So dial plan is pretty good now in terms of showing you syntax errors. The first thing you should do is when you do a dial plan reload, look for warnings. It will give you information about things like missing brackets and some fairly basic syntax checking. Otherwise, you run the dial plan and look at it and make sure that it doesn't bomb out. Or the major ones would be like in the go-to ifs or any thing where you use the dollar square braces to do checks for true-false selections. Making sure that you do the normal standard dial plan stuff. So if it's a channel variable that you've set, lead it with a 0 or double quotes or something, and then check it with something that has double quotes, mostly so that you never end up with a blank equals foo. That's very bad. So you want to have like double quotes equals double quote foo, things like that. So.